Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. As you've heard, I represented a state called North Dakota. We have a lot of energy, renewable energy, but also a lot of fossil energy. And my job when I was in the United States Senate was try and balance those two interests. And now my job at the Institute of Politics is to try and encourage young people to see things through a different lens, to think about the challenges that we have and how do we become persuasive in those challenges from a different perspective. And so I want you all to imagine yourself listening to this discussion if you were Boilermakers in a power plant in North Dakota. What would you believe would be practical? What would you believe would be to your benefit in this climate discussion? Because as Dick just said, and I just want to say this as a personal privilege, Dick Durbin is one of the most principled, practical, amazing senators in the United States Senate. You guys should be so proud, especially if you're from Chicago. You don't see him a lot on television, but his impact is huge. And so Dick told you that we're going to decide whether we are headed towards a sustainable climate policy in this country, where people actually think this is a problem that needs to be tackled. But the most important thing that we can do, and I think the brilliance of this institute will be the fact that you have added sustainable growth. Not just what we can do in terms of practice, but is it possible to balance those two interests and come up with policies and come up with public opinion and I think sustainable policy that people go, yeah, that works for me. And just I will tell you that our policy in this country on climate has been full of goodies, lots of carrots and few sticks. I mean, that's just where we are. And so I want to start out by asking John, who has been in this world for a long time and just an absolute clear voice on the threat. In your job of advancing policies and looking at sustainability, how difficult has it been to tell people that we can have both, that we can have sustainable growth and also a climate policy that addresses what so many people here believe is an existential threat?
Look, I think that's a question for people all across the planet, as Michael suggested in laying down the, and by the way, congratulations on the Institute. It's really an amazing achievement. That's the question for everyone. And I think in our administration, President Biden, Vice President Harris thought they had an answer to that, which is that by supporting an investment-led strategy to transform the economy from one that's powered by polluting fossil fuels to one that's built on clean energy across every sector, not just power, but transportation, buildings, agriculture and forestry, as well as industrial processes, we could produce both strong growth, strong investment, strong business creation, and strong job growth. And I think the proof's in the pudding. We've seen $450 billion worth of clean energy investments announced in the United States since they came into office. Most of that since the Inflation Reduction Act has been passed. Again, it's spread across the entire country, north, south, east, west. We're seeing a renaissance in manufacturing here in the U.S. And I think what's happened as a result of saying we can tackle this problem, we can transform our economy, we can decarbonize it through an investment-led strategy, is we've seen other countries follow suit. So in Japan, they passed what's called GX. In Europe, it's the Green Industrial Strategy. You know, across the world, I think people are looking to do what we absolutely need to do as a society, which is to go from highly polluting fossil fuels to transition away, to use the COP Dubai term, to clean forms of energy. And the one thing I would quibble with him, and then I'll let him have some time back, is Michael said that fossil fuels are still the cheapest form of energy. That's increasing. Many places. That's increasingly not true in the electricity sector, where solar has become cheaper than fossils in most places. And that's why you saw, for the first time, the U.S. new generation the majority was in solar power here. That's happening across the world. And it doesn't account for your primary research, which is the cost of inaction. And we're seeing that take place with the 20 million children in southern Africa who are experiencing malnutrition from extreme drought, the fires in the Amazon and the Pantanal, what we talked about in the U.S., the hurricanes here, the fires in the West. If you do what you told us to do, look at that social cost of carbon, then I think the balance comes heavily on the side of clean.
And do you want to respond to just the...
Well, sure. Let me just start by saying what an honor it is to be on a panel with you, Senator Heitkamp, and with John, whose career I have followed closely and always wondered, are there like actually three Johns? And his, particularly both of your willingness to engage in the details, at least from an academic's perspective, amazing. Honor to be here. So, look, what is the core problem? I like to come back to that. The core problem is, and we can argue about in how many settings and how many places, fossil fuels still remain less expensive than the alternative low carbon energy sources. And I know of only two ways to fix that problem. One, I was so glad to hear John make a loud and vociferous argument for carbon tax. By having fossil fuels pay their full freight, their full damages, as John articulated, which, by the way, that's a choice that we don't do that. You would level the playing field. They would no longer be subsidized. And our choices would be totally different. So one thing that I've done a little work on is if you really took account of that, nuclear, which kind of looks like barely hanging on, you have to pass special policies for it to keep it going, like nuclear would look like a great option. Current nuclear technology, not even the ones coming down the line. So option one is to find a way to level the playing field by making fossil fuels pay their full costs. And it currently, in most parts of the world, it is a construction, our choice, that we don't do that. And I don't think we should be allowed to be surprised at that.
And we do the opposite. We subsidize fossil fuels.
Yeah.
That's right.
The other way is, if we think that that's politically very challenging, which it has proven to be in many settings, would be, I guess I'm looking at Shirley, would be to find some way to make the low carbon energy sources less expensive so that even though they're competing with one arm tied behind their back, they have a way to be competitive with the fossils. And I think that will require enormous investments in kind of basic research and technology so that we find things that we don't know yet. And that's, of course, something that universities want to do.
And not just on cost, Shirley, but also on redundancy and reliability. Intermittency with renewables is a huge challenge and remains a huge challenge. And the work that you're doing, and I think if you're out there supporting this work, I want to tell you how critically important that piece is. And so can't wait to hear your discussion. But I want to go back to this idea that we're on a trajectory of investment, and all things are going to be rosy in the future. We're going to have an election. A lot of folks have said, I am going to repeal the, and we know you don't even need to repeal it, you just need to slow it down, not spend the money. The Inflation Reduction Act, we have a Senate Ag Committee that is trying to roll back some of the conservation agricultural provisions. And we don't have a country that is united.
House Ag.
Yeah, House, yeah. I said House.
Oh,
I know which side that is. Well, never mind. Anyway, so I think that when you have a whole plan that's based on private investment, but you don't have certainty, you don't have predictability in your policies. So let's talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is supported by many fossil companies. In fact, many of the large oil companies have said they would not ask that it be repealed, but yet it has become a whipping horse, in part because it was Biden's policy. But talk about whether you think the Inflation Reduction Act, number one, is good policy on Michael's part, but also sustainable policy in terms of investment.
You know it better than
Well, first of all, I think that, as I said, you've seen this tremendous reaction from the private sector, and they're now developing projects, plans, factories, deployment of renewables that have changed, I think, the politics. So I think the one thing that's actually quite sticky in our climate policy, which is debated between the two parties, is in fact this investment-led Inflation Reduction Act. I think it's quite popular in red states and blue. There's a greater investment in red states and red districts than in blue states. You saw 18 Republican members write a letter to the Speaker in August saying, don't repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. We're relying on this for jobs in our district. So I think that there's still ideology in the system, and you know, in my current role, I can't really talk about politics, but at least one of the candidates is saying, you know, continues, as the senator noted, to call climate change a hoax. You can do with that what you will. But I think it's pretty sticky. I think it's the rest of the climate agenda that is really susceptible to change and to movement. Michael suggests that we do nothing to kind of price carbon. In fact, I think we do. There is carbon pricing in the U.S. We just implemented a new fee on methane from the production of oil and gas,
which has been stayed by the courts,
and
right?
I think no.
Oh, not that one. Just the rule for BLM.
But I think that the other thing that's been a hallmark of this administration is to use the authorities we have under the Clean Air Act to directly reduce carbon through regulation. So whether that's in the power sector, in transportation, through the tailpipe emission standards, you could call that a kind of proxy price or whatever, but it's a direct intervention to reduce emissions from emitting sectors, and that has consequences. That's why we have cleaner air than we've had in the past, and that balance is at issue because I think if past this prologue, what we saw in the previous administration was the attempt to roll back a lot of the environmental protections that have been put in place by the Obama administration.
So let me make a couple points. First, on the IRA, one thing that I think has not quite received enough attention that is really remarkable. On the tax credits, it was quite, did a very good job of, I think, being as technology neutral as possible. And one thing, and I want to connect that to the innovation that the world so desperately needs, is if you took the IRA policy and implemented it, I'm going to make up a number, let's call it 10 years ago, actually it probably would not, of the tax credits, it would not have passed a cost-benefit test in the sense that the reductions in carbon would have cost more than the reduction in climate damages. But what is remarkable is the improvements in solar and wind and in batteries in the last decade have now taken these technologies, which are competing on a largely uneven playing field, and turned that into like a socially positive thing. It's getting reductions in tons. They're less expensive than, if you totally wonk out, less expensive than the social cost of carbon. And so I think that's been an excellent part, and I think that part is probably very stable and almost, I don't know, I'm curious John's view, but probably immune to the election.
Yeah, I think that's right. The other thing that I think, and one of the reasons for the change in politics a little bit, is I think the president was very thoughtful in saying that we want growth, we want investment, we want it in these clean technologies, but we care about where it happens too.
Yeah.
And so there are incentives in the bill and in the structure of the credits that Michael was talking about to ensure that the jobs that are created are good paying jobs by giving a 5x bonus for paying prevailing wage, using certified apprentices, et cetera, that you can create a career out of. And the credits that, the enhancement of the credit to invest in traditional energy communities, in disadvantaged communities, has meant, and there's plenty now of Treasury analysis to show that that's had a significant impact to move investment to places that have often felt left out and left behind during the course of the transition.
And I think it's important when you think about this piece, and I know the president was highly supportive, but this bill was written by Joe Manchin. And it was written so that states that are in transition can be really active and really push a big benefit. Michael, you want to add?
Yeah,
to
and
that?
then I just I think John thought I was being sharp with him about carbon pricing. That was not actually my point. I mean,
Sure it was.
we could do that, but I thought I was being sly. But I'm a big believer in the regulatory machine, and the regulatory machine can be used quite effectively. It has to be done sector by sector. It's obviously less efficient than having an economy-wide carbon price, and I think there's been a lot of great work in updating the social cost of carbon and that allowing for stricter regulation. But really what I was pointing to was not the U.S. It was a global statement I was making. And so one question that I would kind of have for John is, it's super important that the United States begin to make progress, but it is also true that 2023 and I think 2024 are record years for CO2 emissions globally. And so I want to come back to, it has to be the case that people are willing to make this choice. And
I want to transition to the global, but first I want to challenge John a little bit on his statement that the Clean Air Act is a vehicle for controlling carbon. I'm not convinced that's true anymore in wake of the reversal of Chevron. I'm not sure it's true with the new Supreme Court that we have, even though in the past they have, in fact, read an expansive view of the Clean Air Act. So let's just agree to put a pin in that one, John, and suggest that maybe we need to revisit the role that the Clean Air Act can play in carbon restrictions. Let's turn globally, because I will tell you, as someone who was there when the Paris Agreement was signed, I had tons of Republican senators coming to me asking me to basically sign on with them on a resolution saying this was a treaty, not appropriate, and why should we do it all when the rest of the world is where the growth in CO2 emissions is coming. And so this is a political atmosphere that we're still active in and still participating in. So how do you best respond on the role that the United States can play globally in addressing that balance of sustainability with climate control?
Well, look, obviously, particularly the large developing economies, particularly China, China accounts for 30% of global emissions. Yeah. India is the third largest emitter in the world now. So if everybody needs to be in the game, and you asked, though, specifically about the United States and that moment, I think one of the things that President Obama deserves credit for was in 2014, the year before Paris was signed, going to Beijing, we worked on an agreement with the Chinese to say, in the construct of a nationally determined commitment to reduce emissions or to stabilize emissions, that they did President Xi and President Obama made that announcement. That really was the spark that led to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is built around a different structure than the previous Kyoto Protocol, which the United States could never ratify. It is built around a national framework and transparency and accountability to the global system. So that's the framework we're operating in, and we need everybody to participate. Last year, we had a successful outcome in the Conference of Parties in Dubai, and the countries of the world agreed to come forward with, first of all, to transition away from fossil fuels. That was a major breakthrough, first time that's happened. And then to come forward with 2035 nationally determined commitments, NDCs, that were economy-wide, 1.5 aligned, and covered all greenhouse gases. So the question is, those are due in February. The question is, will countries actually come forward in doing that? That's where I'm running around the world now trying to convince the rest of the world that we're going to do our part. That depends a little bit on what happens in 6 days. And we're going to come forward with a commitment, as the president did in 2021 for 2030. We're going to update that, but also that they need to do it. In the case of China, for example, they made a pledge back then in 2014 to install 1,200 gigawatts of renewable power by 2030. They met that deadline 6 years ahead of schedule. They did it this year. And we're pressing them to say that they have essentially peaked in their emissions. They need to show real cuts by 2035 on the order of 30%. But we're going to be able to judge that when people come forward. And I feel pretty good about the discussions we're having with the EU, with Japan, with the Republic of Korea, with Brazil, with Indonesia. But there's an elephant in the room, which is what's China going to do?
Yeah, that I would tell you, in crisis, when you think the natural gas isn't going to come from Russia, maybe you start up your coal-fired power plants again if you're Germany, right? And so,
they didn't do that.
Right, but these economic challenges add to, they make a difference in the prioritization of climate goals.
Sure.
And so, Michael, that's really what you're getting at with this institute, is trying to figure out how do you create an energy an energy world where the sustainability of that is built on acceptance that we can in fact do this and still grow. Yep. And so how do you respond to countries that say, you put up the chart, right, on how many megawatts of energy or kilowatts of energy one person uses in India compared to this country, and then you're going to go tell India you have to get on board and on the climate train and reduce your emissions. How do you do that when we look like we're we built our economy, now you get to curtail yours?
Yeah, so I have a mix of reactions. First, let me say, it's like a talking point inside universities. Oh, these climate agreements are voluntary, and then they kind of wah, and oh, they don't mean anything. I actually think I have a much more glass half full version of that. And one thing I'll say, John's been very modest. That 2014 agreement with China, is my understanding, absolutely would not have happened without him. And then, like domino, that caused the Paris thing. And so he deserves a lot of credit for that. But what I want to underscore, what comes out of those negotiations that's so important, is when China cuts a ton, or India or Bangladesh cuts a ton, they're doing a favor to us. They're providing benefits to us. And that's kind of the game of the international negotiations. Like, cutting in isolation is kind of missing the larger picture. The larger picture is, we want to do cuts because guys will maybe do 6 or 7 tons in exchange for one of our tons, and that will provide benefits that has reduced climate damages for the United States. And so I think that dynamic should not be lost. Now, let me pick a little bit I think it's your question and the kind of wah that exists inside academia sometimes about this is, these climate agreements are voluntary. And so there's really, I think, a limited range of ways to make them not voluntary. The Europeans are experimenting with border tariff adjustments. That's one thing you could do. You could have, you could actually use all tariffs as a kind of very blunt instrument. That would be kind of a second thing to do. And then a third would be, I think the rich countries, and picking up on the graph, which obviously stuck with you, Heidi, I love that you love graphs, is like, well, if it's so meaningful to us, maybe we would be willing to put money in a fund in exchange for reductions from other countries who find the current situation unfair. And so I'm very curious to hear John's views on kind of beginning to put teeth on these agreements and what the prospects for that might look like, where everyone would want to participate.
Interestingly enough, Sheldon Whitehouse, along with Bill Cassidy, Sheldon's from Rhode Island, and absolutely the leader in the Senate on climate. Bill Cassidy, Republican senator from Illinois, or from Louisiana, have both introduced climate border adjustment bills. And so that is one idea that has gone from academics to actual discussion. But we only have a few minutes, but I want to raise this, give you a number. I recently read a number that one Google search, just using the search engine in Google, if you did that same thing using AI, it would use 10 times more power. What we haven't talked about here is this mammoth growth in the demand for energy that is going to come with the AI revolution. And so we think we have a manageable cohort here of what energy we're going to need. It is going to explode if, in fact, the AI economy explodes. How do you deal with that, both of you?
I see Calvin over there. He's going to come and explain that. Look, we've lived for almost a generation with flat load in the United States. I mean, there's been a lot of increase in growth, et cetera, but it's been managed by more efficiency in the system. Now we're seeing a big spike in demand for electricity in particular. That's coming from data centers. It's coming from AI. It's going to increase from 3% to maybe 9% in the course of this decade of total electricity consumption. We're seeing it from electrification of transportation. We're seeing it from electrification of buildings. So there are a lot of drivers of growth. The question is, are we going to build that out clean? And are we going to have a grid that can support that kind of load growth? Those are big challenges, but I think it is possible, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're responsive to that. We've kind of got a balkanized regulatory system in the United States that's based on states and regions, not on national policy, but we're doing everything we can to build out transmission, to use advanced technologies in the grid, to build out more clean power, to do it where there's already interconnection, to get rid of the long interconnection queues through incentives and regulation. And by the way, to use AI, we just did a convening at the White House yesterday. It's already seems like a week ago, between the providers and some of the companies about how we can use AI to improve the performance of actually getting clean resources online.
Michael?
You know, I think I like John's answer quite a bit. What I would say is there can be a tendency sometimes, maybe in the historical press sometimes, about shaming particular forms of energy consumption. I think in general, energy consumption produces benefits that are great for society. And if they don't, you know, that form of consumption will go away. And so like if the AI search is not outproducing the regular Google search over time, we'll stop doing it that way. And so I want to come back to, which I'm bastardizing John's version into the way I want to describe it, which is the challenge is, are we creating the conditions where the low carbon energy sources are going to be less expensive, be it through getting rid of transmission constraints or through pricing or through tax incentives or whatever it is? That's the core question in my view. And not all policies are going to be good ideas there, but I think a lot of them are.
I think, though, one of the core questions is, even if you could demonstrate that, do you have the public will to make those transitions? And that's the challenge that we have today, which is trying to find the ability or the kind of public will. I mean, I think all politics is, you know, I think people have this idea that, you know, Jim Inhofe throws a snowball on the floor of the Senate and says there's no such thing as global warming, and that somehow is a policy statement. That's not a policy statement. In many of these states, a lot of the aversion to making this transition doesn't come from somebody's ideological, you know, kind of idea, you know, sense. It comes from what they're hearing from their constituency. And, you know, Michael, I'm going to challenge you a little bit. If I'm, you know, running my car on gasoline, I go up to the pump and I know what that costs. If I'm doing a Google search, I don't know what that costs in terms of energy. I'm removed from that connection as consumer or as worker from the cost of energy. And I think that that's been a real challenge. And the thing that the consumers hear repeatedly is, if we make this transition, it will cost me more. And you could point to Colorado, where they actually did some work in low-income families who are hit harder by higher cost, energy costs, ended up doing homework by candlelight. I can show you the article and the story. So how do you bring the public along with the urgency of climate, but also convince them that this will in fact be economically viable for them and affordable for them?
So, in the beauty of the classroom and the blackboard, I would describe this, there is a redistribution problem here, which is that...
You got to remember, these are all power plant workers now. They're all Boilermakers.
Oh, sorry. Let me try and say it in English. The higher energy costs hurt some people more than others. There's no question about that. And I think trying to find policies that don't choose to ignore that, but take that very seriously and front and center, finding ways to rebate money to those families, or lead to economic development in the areas where there's concentrations of people who are going to be hurt. I think that's a totally legitimate thing to do. And that also, of course, has to be balanced with what I would say the benefits you're getting from it. If we could stop the carbon emissions, that's going to produce a safer place for our children and their children. And that's a hard message, I understand, because it's not today. But.
Right.
Well, look, I think you have to directly attack the problem you're raising, Heidi. I think we've done that through rebates and through tax incentives to buy energy efficient appliances, to do whole home retrofits. In the end of the day, last year, 3.5 million families took advantage of that to the tune of $8 billion worth of tax savings. That saves money twice, because they're putting in that equipment with some cost savings on their tax bill, and then they have long-term savings on their energy bill. But we need to take account of the real world and keep support. The one thing I would say, a little bit different than the experience with the Affordable Care Act, the support for clean energy, notwithstanding the politics, has stayed relatively stable and relatively high across the political spectrum and across the country. So I think people want cleaner alternatives. There's been a lot of reporting on the uptake in electric vehicles. It's a little bit slower than some people predicted, but it's still going up pretty fast. It's now 18. Last year it was 18% plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles of total sales in the U.S. In China, it's 50%. So, I think the life cycle savings for people are real, and that's why people are moving towards thinking about those choices. We've got still lots of problems to solve, charging, et cetera, but I think people want to go in this direction.
Well, I want to thank both of you. We're out of time, but this is such an important discussion. But I think that the reason why this is the opening dialogue is because it recognizes that you can't just be interested and concerned about climate. You've got to figure out how we can reach that balance. And Michael, I really applaud you and the president and the university for tackling this. John, you are a champion. We are so fortunate here at the University of Chicago to have you. And, if I made you all Boilermakers, you now can go back to being somebody who you are. And good luck to all of you, and good luck to the new endeavor. Thank you.